Welcome to the Unknown Webcast, where those who join us regularly know that I am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. As a result, those who are new should be aware this is not a safe space for you if you are easily offended by having your ideas challenged or by our satire, which some do think is offensive. Today is May 28, 2019, and this is broadcast number 146. This week, we are joined by Dr. Jason Crowder while we tackle the subject of corrupting young minds, a philosophy of intellectual education. Now, we're not suggesting we should corrupt young minds. We're concerned that they are being corrupted, just to clarify.
Okay.
This is probably a spoiler alert, but we are not in favor of corrupting young minds.
Now, why'd you have to go and tell them? Okay.
Yeah, I know. You do like that, yeah. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie.
Who are you calling senior here? But hey, by the way,
you are a senior. You're elderly.
Who is offended by our satire? Are you kidding?
Many are offended by our satire.
Well, then we need to keep doing it. We need to double down then, because I don't think
do twice as much each week.
Yes, I think so. Our sponsors for this program include World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet and the Grievance Industrial Complex, because things are never bad enough already. And if you enjoy our program, or if it really annoys you and you would simply like to inflict it upon others to ensure your continued access or anyone else's to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. So here we are with Jason.
And Jason Crowder, who I've gotten to know a little better in recent months. He is on board with International Society of Christian Apologetics, of which I'm also a member. In good standing, but that doesn't mean they like me. They just have to put up with me.
That means you're just able to stand well. You don't fall down much.
That's right. I don't fall down very often, at least.
Yeah, right.
And he also teaches at Columbia Evangelical Seminary, Washington State, Lone Star College in Texas, and whatever else he does besides International Society of Christian Apologetics. And his topic today is corrupting young minds. And we had to make sure we were clarifying. We're not suggesting we ought to corrupt young minds.
So this is not a how-to.
This is not a how-to. No, if you came here... If you came here to learn how to do that, you are clearly in the wrong place.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we're going out of our way to make these clarifications, because you just never know.
Yeah, you just never know, and it is important. So
we don't want to mislead people.
When I set this up, I want to look at just briefly. I had an article that came across my desk yesterday, or my internet screen actually, by Dennis Prager, who I really like a lot. He's
I like him too.
Good, clear thinker. Unfortunately, he's not a Christian, but he actually argues better for the Christian faith, oddly enough, than many Christians do. But he has an article.
Surprising.
Yeah.
Really.
In Town Hall, he has an article called, "Are You Sure You Want to Play Russian Roulette with Your Child's Values?" And he opens up the article with, "Most Americans are not aware how morally and intellectually destructive American colleges and increasingly high schools and even elementary schools have become. So they spend tens of thousands of after tax dollars to send their sons and daughters to college. Are we playing Russian roulette with their values, even with their intellect? Jason, are colleges corrupting young minds, and if so, in what ways?"
There's many ways we're doing it. A lot of times we are telling people, instead of how to think, we're basically telling them what to think, and how we want them to regurgitate what our professors are wanting them to know. Certain tests in subject matters we simply got to know certain matters, right? Biology, for example, chemistry, you got to know certain things. Of course, you got to be able to regurgitate what the subject matters are. Simply. Math, same way. 2 + 2 is 4. Of course, those subject matters, you got to know those things. You got to simply, it's a matter of memorization, right? But when we get to certain other subjects, we want our students to be able to critically think about those subject matters instead of simply regurgitating what the professor wants. However, certain education models are not doing that anymore. They simply want, the professor wants, or the teacher in lower levels want the student to simply say, we don't want you to think that way anymore. We want you to simply tell us what we want you to tell us. For example, if a student is being raised in a home of faith, whether it's Christian, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, and the teacher is non-religious, and that student is writing an essay, say in a sociology or an English class, and they talk about that faith, the teacher's may say, you can't talk about your faith anymore on papers. So they're trying to indoctrinate and get that student to say, no, you can't talk about your faith anymore. Instead of trying to get them to critically think about a issue and integrate English and whatever.
Now, this is really interesting to me because, I've taken college level English classes, and I was able to take some of them at a local junior college and then, transfer them in for my bachelor's degrees. Was kind of convenient. And so this is my undergraduate was at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, which is evangelical free denomination school. But I remember one of my English classes, an English lit class, so we're learning English lit, and we had to write a paper, and we had to read this paper in class, and we were reading Mark Twain. Okay, this is 19th century, English lit. And, you'd think you're going to write a paper and you're going to talk about, the genre, you're going to talk about how effective Twain was in this or that, it's literature, right? It's literature. What is being accomplished with the literature? Well, one of the students gets up, and this is back in the 80s. Okay, this is a long time ago.
So back in the old days.
Yeah, we the only tablets we had were the kind we swallowed, or
oh my! I get a headache thinking about that.
The chalkboard tablets. Well, anyways, so
or the yellow legal pads.
Yeah, we had those. Do you still have one of those? Okay. Well, anyways.
Yes, I do.
And one of the female students in the class gets up, and somehow she, and this is the 80s, these are the Reagan years, okay? She gets up and she launches into this, passionate discourse about, talks about, Abby Hoffman, the Students for a Democratic Society. I mean, she's totally still living the 60s, which right now I'm having a big deja vu, just like everything, that the 60s radicals were into, we're taking
like Yogi Berra would say, it's deja vu all over again.
Yeah, it's like just exponentially we're there. And wait a minute, this is English lit. How did you turn this into a political exercise? She was the only one in the class I remember who did that. But now I'm getting the impression it happens a lot in college level English classes. It's almost like the norm. And you better express a political opinion that the professor agrees with in many cases.
It does. For example, this past semester I was teaching world religions, which with world religions we could get into politics, we could get into philosophy, we could get into literature, you name it. it could come into topics, which in my classes, I tell the students first day of class, frankly, I don't care if you don't agree with me. I don't necessarily want you to agree with me. I just want to make sure you can defend your position. Which is, they're like, what? You don't have to regurgitate what you say.
We have to think for ourselves.
Yeah, you guys got to think for yourselves. I say, I want you to defend your position. I want you to be able to think and realize that all these different issues relate to each other. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, this ethical issue on this matter relates to this. This relates to this. This relates to this. They're like, what? Yes, this matter in history relates to this issue going on. This issue that pops up in the news 2 weeks ago relates to this issue that we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks. They're like, oh my.
So they were intimidated.
They're overwhelmed. I don't know if it's so much intimidation. They're like,
even that's beyond intimidation then.
Yeah, it's beyond intimidation.
Well, and we have things as we look at the current, the current sort of star of a particular party. I don't want to get too far into politics, but I do want to talk about this individual because of something she said. You were mentioning certain things are just true, like you go through math, for example, 2 + 2 is 4. And as it turns out, Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, I just say AOC. I mean, that's her Twitter handle.
A really long name, AOC. Was asked about some kind of a problem in some statistical data that she was giving, and she concluded that math is racist. Math is racist because it didn't support her claim. So therefore, math is racist.
Well, if it's okay.
So it kind of feels like, and we were talking about this before we went live, and I get this even from the Christian sector when they're trying to argue for a particular set of goings on, like say the Signs and Wonders movement, that a person with an experience is never at the mercy of a person with an argument. What's wrong with that?
Say that again. Okay, a person with an experience.
A person with an experience is never
at the mercy
of a person with an argument.
So, in other words, you could flip it around and say the person with the argument is at the mercy of the person with the experience.
Yes.
Which sometimes it's easier to grasp what's being said. Okay, the person with the argument has to give in to the person who has the experience.
Right, because experience trumps.
Okay,
it's not Donald Trump. It's
I was going to say there, Don.
See, all these trigger words are going to be so careful.
You're triggering me, Don. You're triggering me.
Then what's the basis of truth? Because
I guess it's experience.
But then what? In a court of law, if experience is truth, then our justice system falls flat. Because everything's going to be relative.
So like my experience is that I really, really like smashing windows and taking things that I see on the other side of the window. I just my experience. Are you trying to deny me the truth of my experience?
But my experience says that in this case, my experience says I prefer smashing your hands because I find that more pleasurable while you're breaking the window. I find smashing your hands more pleasurable.
Well, that's
but
because
the cops find it more pleasurable arresting us both.
Maybe you're just a violent hater. Maybe I could just. I know what you're saying.
But the law, at some point, it's all becomes relative because the truth of the matter is our court systems are all based on truth. So if we just say experience trumps everything else, then our justice system, our court system, our legal system all goes away.
Well, see, if I was going to be a good modern day university student, I probably would argue that your court systems are not based on truth. They are only based on what white men agreed a long time ago that they were going to judge everybody else on in order to hold white power. And so we need to abandon that and have a different kind of way to evaluate what's right and wrong, which is my feelings.
Isn't white the automatic color of the oppressor? No matter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Just checking. So here's the thing, though. When you talk about arguments versus experience, you're really talking about two forms of reasoning that have been not at war, but in some cases at war with each other since philosophy began. You have arguments. You're talking about things like deductive reasoning. Arguments can use experience. They can use empirical data.
Right.
But the rationalist approach usually, begins with first principles, and then derives, truth claims, from additional truth claims from the first principles. So you have an argument based purely on reason, versus the argument based purely on empiricism. Now, we have to admit sometimes our observations are correct. Sometimes, the proof is in the pudding. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes, on the other hand, sometimes pictures do lie. Sometimes, it's not actually pudding. You really don't want to know what it is. So but if it's a good argument, okay, and if it's an argument that combines, it can combine observation, which is an experience. When you observe something, you're experiencing it, and it can combine deductions from both first principles and empirical observations. And when it's a good argument, and yet I'm using my experience, my limited, narrow, parochial, minute experience. I think that's where we've come to as a society. I am just one person out of literally billions and billions of people. And yet I think my experience is determinative of truth. And that's where we've come to. They allow it to be determinative for my truth. I'm allowed to have my own separate truth today, as long as it doesn't go against the emerging first principles that the ultra hard left is peddling.
Right, which brings us back then to corrupting young minds, a philosophy of intellectual education. How is it, Jason, that you believe, or you're observing, maybe experiencing, the corruption of young minds at the university level?
People don't want to have when it comes to truths relating to, say, religious worldviews, they want that truth to be when religious claims, for example, Eastern religions are open to accepting worldviews of different religions. Hinduisms, Buddhisms, they're willing to accept religious claims of various religions. When you get into world religions of Christianity and Islam, they make specific religious claims that are very specific and are not willing to accept religious claims of other religions. And when those religious claims contradict each other, the Christian, for example, in Christianity, Christ says in John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through me. other religious worldviews do not want those religious views tested. So in the university setting, when we get to those religious worldviews and those particular truth claims, that they don't want those religious views tested. So they want that religious claim to be go untested. The same thing with religious truth claims of Islam, Judaism, that are very exclusive. They want it to be just, okay, that's your truth. Let's accept it and move on.
Now, some religious truth claims we really can't test. I mean, at least not in a way. Like, for instance, there are ways of testing them, but those ways only make sense if you first accept that the text is scripture, that the text is, like, for instance, the truth claim of 6 24-hour days of creation. Okay. Unless you're arguing between Christians over whether that's the right interpretation of those words, in which case you could devise tests, exegetical, hermeneutical tests, okay, to determine whether you're interpreting it correctly. Outside of that, there's no way to test that truth claim scientifically. We can't go back in time.
Right.
We can't get on the other side of the event
Right. On certain claims, you can't. On certain historical claims, we can test whether there's historical evidence to prove certain things.
Those kind of tests.
We can claim, but there's certain things on even historical claims. People don't want you testing those in the university setting.
Well, they really are. Yeah, they don't want you to. They really are consider you evil, actually, if you try to test them. We say that with this new kind of gender question, and this is very recent. But where does it come from? It comes from the universities. This largely derives this idea that no, there aren't just two genders. There are like 73 or some such a matter of genders.
Correct.
And it's not objectively definable, discernible, or verifiable. It is only what you feel that becomes important. The feeling is what's true, not what you can objectively prove. So someone who is, and it seems like, if I understand this correctly, Congress or the Senate has just passed legislation which would provide that those who are biologically male can compete with female athletic events and dominate each sporting event that they're involved with, because they're obviously stronger physically and more capable physically to do those kinds of things. But if you try to argue against that, well, you're racist, bigoted, homophobic, whatever.
And eventually a lawbreaker. You're in violation of a federal statute.
Yep.
So, yeah, how convenient.
But would that federal statute actually demand that there's something verifiable that you could prove one way or the other? Or is it simply that you stated something with which they disagree that means it's illegal?
It doesn't really matter when you're doing 15 to 20. Yeah, the nuance, the careful nuances kind of escape me at that point.
See, that's how you are, Ron. You're just
yeah. So, but and when that bill was just introduced, just like in the last week.
Yes.
Yeah. Then you got the president of Ratio Christi come out. The president CEO saying he was forced out of his doctoral program at Purdue because his Christian faith, because his committee chair wouldn't do his dissertation, and other students recent.
Really? Who was that?
Within the last week.
President of Radio Christi.
Yeah.
I want evangelicals to know okay, this sounds terrible, this sounds horrible, and it is, okay, but we've been here before. Okay, a lot of evangelicals,
Oh, you're kidding.
a lot. I mean, it hasn't been on the scale. It hasn't. Well, maybe actually it has, but during the 1950s, in the Chicago area, they did this experiment called they if I recall, it was called, they federalized the doctoral programs they did of the seminaries in the Chicago area. Now, the Chicago has a pretty large body of seminaries, and they centralized the doctoral candidacy process. This was explained to me by my master's supervisor, Dr. Walter Elwell. I'm going to have to call him and ask him to re-explain this to me so I get the terminology correct. What happened to many conservative evangelicals is they found themselves in the Chicago area. They picked one of the seminaries and they decided, like maybe they graduated from Moody. Of course, you couldn't get a bachelor's back then from Moody, but you could go on and get a bachelor's from another evangelical college like Wheaton or Trinity in the area. And then you wanted to go on for graduate or postgraduate work. Well, why travel all the way to New York? I mean, some of them did, but maybe some of them couldn't. So they would pick a seminary in the Chicago area, like, for instance, the University of Chicago Divinity School, very prestigious school. And this actually happened. They got some of these guys got all the way through their doctoral programs. They got all the way up to dissertation. They were ABD, all but dissertation students. And their dissertation was rejected solely on the basis that they were labeled fundamentalists.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes it had nothing to do with the content of the dissertation. And some of these guys, thankfully, were able to transfer to British and European universities and not take quite as long to finish because they'd already done so much work. But they were denied the opportunity, and terrible injustices were done. This was not, as I understand today, it's not possible for this to happen given the current system. And so you see a lot of conservative evangelicals graduating from liberal institutions without the same kind of hassles. But there was definite academic persecution against conservative theology going on back in the 1950s. So the fact that we got out of it, I think, is probably a hopeful sign. There is a backlash. There's always going to be a backlash. The question is, will it be enough? So,
yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah. I mean, how good is how successful has the backlash in Venezuela been? It looked pretty hopeful a few weeks ago. It looked like, gee, we might get rid of Maduro. But,
well, except Maduro has control of the army, the police, and the weapons. You have really no recourse against government like that. I was just looking at Corey. What's his name here? Corey Miller, president of Ratio Christi, and his story. And he makes an interesting statement here. He says, as the university goes, so goes the culture. This is really what we're talking about today. As the university goes, so goes the culture. The university is the most influential institution in Western civilization. From it come our doctors, lawyers, political leaders, journalists, artists, K through 12 educators, and even future professors. Stalin once said, quote, ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons. Why should we let them have ideas? End quote. Abraham Lincoln said, quote, the philosophy in the classroom is in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next, end quote. He is absolutely right in both of these quotes. So, Ron, it's time to do a short break. Why don't we do that? And then we're going to come back and ask Jason to weigh in on how we overcome this if we do.
Well, okay. We do have a couple of sponsors we mentioned earlier. One of them is World's End Theology Outlet, your Your what do I say when I talk about them? Your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, other ideas, whose time has gone, and they're trying to encourage our young university, college students, and they say, so after 4 semesters at your small progressive liberal arts college, you're flying home to visit your red state relatives. You remembered to bring your emotional support puppies. You packed all your comfort blankets and pillows. You even remembered your adult coloring books. But still, it still feels like something is missing. You don't feel safe. What can you do? You need instant safe space. Its patented anti-free speech technology will protect you among your friends and relatives back in that red state. It has guaranteed protection from trigger words, microaggressions, cognitive dissonance, and unwelcome thoughts. You'll feel protected. You'll feel safe with instant safe space available at World's End Theology Outlet.
And there you have it, instant safe space, in case you didn't know what to do next.
Yes.
So, since, and I think Corey Miller is right in quoting in both of these quotes, that the universities really are kind of the center of guidance for the thought for tomorrow. They are training our lawyers, our teachers, our professors, our politicians. The thought shapers of culture are coming out of the universities. How do we respond to this? Because they clearly are corrupting young minds.
They are. First thing is we need to be praying where we send our students. And sadly to say, we can't necessarily trust to send our students to the Christian university as a safe haven, because not all of our Christian universities are immune to the problem. Unfortunately anymore, like they used to be.
Immune or part of the problem?
I think you said they're not immune, right?
They're not immune.
Right, they're not immune. They're part of the problem.
They are part of the problem, unfortunately. Many of them have either gone to a weak doctrinal statement of faith where they don't adhere to a strong statement of faith anymore, or if they do have a strong statement of faith, they don't hold their faculty to it. Like we were talking about earlier before the show started, or they redefine certain terms in their doctrinal statement of faith where they could allow faculty to teach under redefining certain key terms to make it more palatable or they don't allow, or they have faculty in certain departments where they don't integrate their faith into the discipline they're teaching. For example, in undergrad, I was at a Christian university where the English department, certain one faculty member, didn't see a need for allowing the ministerial students to integrate their faith into writing their English papers, where other faculty members did. We still had to write the literature papers on the topic, but many of the books we read, Flannery O'Connor, for one, many of the themes in her books were religious. Mm-hmm. So why not integrate the religious aspects and different topics we're going to encounter in Christianity into those papers, since the topics in Flannery O'Connor's topics in her books and short stories dealt with issues that we're going to deal with as theology, philosophy.
What about let's start at a church. Let's start at a family level and then move to a church level, because what we're talking about is what happens at the university level. But there's a whole set of steps that precede that, right? Obviously, many families are not equipped or don't feel equipped to be training young minds, unfortunately, in critical thinking and those sorts of things. I know some homeschooling groups actually have at fourth, fifth, sixth grade levels logic classes. It's pretty amazing as I watch that happen. So there is some attempts, at least by some homeschooling groups, to do that. Why is it that churches are not spending time training and discipling young minds in these areas?
They don't feel equipped either.
Okay. How can that be overcome? Is there a way to do that? And where would that begin?
Begins at the top level on re-educating the minister's priority, the ministerial staff priority, on realizing, hey, we got to start educating the church from within and saying, hey, instead of sending our people out to get educated, we need to start educating our people from within. And I think we had some discussions at the EMNR and ISCA conference. You and I, Don, had a few discussions about this in our room, about this. A few of us others had discussions about this as well at that conference, that, hey, the church needs to start educating inside the church. And it starts training them as young. I think it's Deuteronomy 6:4. Let me look up real quick. Pull up the right app.
Okay, so while he looks up Deuteronomy 6:4, what we're basically arguing is that these educational endeavors begin at the home by parents who are living these things out on a regular basis. And when my kids were growing up, I mean, they grew up in a house of two apologists. We debated ideas. We talked about them around the dinner table. We challenged what we were watching on television. And my daughter would say, Mom, or my son would say, Mom, you're always trying to get to the point of everything, which is what we did.
Mom, why don't you just try to beat around the bush? Okay.
Yep.
Exactly. I mean, for us, these were all different instructional opportunities. Commercials on television, a show we're watching, they're communicating a worldview all of the time, which gives us opportunities to speak to those worldviews when opportunities arise. It isn't all about entertainment, but we seem to have missed that. Now, unfortunately, more parents are not equipped to do that, but isn't that kind of the fault of the church?
It's also a fault of the home. Of course, we could say parents are so busy running here and there. We got our generations didn't seem like our parents are running all over the place. A lot of them were at home more. Nowadays, it seems like everybody's on the go. But at the same token, where's the priority? Are we putting the priority in the wrong place? So it's a matter of priority. What is the priority? So maybe we need to be shifting our priorities back to raising and taking time to take those moments when we're watching a TV program commercial and say, hey, let's take this as a teaching opportunity and say, hey, we need to be discerning about what we're watching, what we're doing, what children are reading. Instead of doing this, maybe we need to be doing this. Taking an interest in what our kids are reading in school and what they're actually learning in school, and supplementing what they're actually doing in school with Christian literature.
Challenging, helping them to think through the claims of the various things that they're reading. And
correct.
I mean, as I think about it, I look back in the first century. I don't find believers running away from society. I mean, the church was a gathering of believers, the family of God, to be trained and equipped and taught. But once they left that gathering, they were, and we see this in the Apostle Paul for sure, they were challenging cultural ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, we live in a time when it just never ceases to amaze me. I am astounded almost every week what an embarrassment of riches we have when it comes to being able to equip our children. When it becomes when we need to equip our adults to deal with some of the problems that the universities are causing through indoctrinating their children. When you go online, it seems like every week somebody's putting up a new lecture series by prominent evangelical academics, people who are trained in their fields. There's software, there are DVDs, there are countless amazing products that are coming out. Books now that used to only be accessible to a very narrow niche market are now available to just anybody who wants them. The problem is we're not giving guidance. We don't have people giving guidance to where to look for the proper resources to deal with these problems. But if you Google them, they're really not that hard to find.
True.
That's been my experience. It never ceases. Another thing that doesn't cease to amaze me is how many goofy questions people ask on Facebook or Twitter that can be answered with a few keystrokes in Google.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of knowledge we have literally at our fingertips is so astounding that it makes us culpable.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us blameworthy.
It does, yes and no. It does, because there's a wealth, you're right. But on the other hand, it is also giving the opportunity for those who have an agenda,
right,
to play with the information. I just saw one today. This something like the first slaves that were brought over in 16 whatever was 100 white children from Ireland. I have no way to know if that's true or not.
right.
And you have, it seems like valid information on both sides of the argument. Which one of them is true? I have no idea.
Well, but the methods we were taught before the internet for discerning that still hold true today.
Yeah.
Look at the source. Is it a reputable publisher? Is it a reputable author? Can you give a bibliographical reference that could be used in an undergraduate term paper or even a high school term paper? If you can't do any of those things, if all you've got is a URL, then you don't really know what you have.
Right. You don't know what the source is, right?
Yeah, you might have a lead. You might have the basis for yet another Google search that will take you to a reputable source. Just like when I go to Wikipedia, I don't assume that any of that stuff is true, but I look at the bibliography, the references, I look at the links, and if the link is to the Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, even that may not be totally reliable, but it's sure better than Wikipedia. It's sure better than 99% of the uncorroborated sources out on the web. So,
right. For example, I don't like Wikipedia other than brainstorming ideas and finding legitimate sources. For example, because the Wikipedia page on plagiarism is 86% plagiarized, which astonishes my students when I point that out to them and show them the plagiarism statistics on it.
They don't have references for what they say. Oh, that's funny.
Which is astonishing. That passage in Deuteronomy I was looking for is Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4-7, which basically tells the Israelites that they are to hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall walk with them when you sit in your house, and you shall walk with them when you lie down and when you rise up. Then in verse 8, you shall bind them on the sign of your head, and you shall on the footlets of your eyes. And then verse 9, you shall write them on the doorposts of the house of your gates and on your gates. And as you know, the Jews actually do that.
Mm-hmm.
They have it posted up. And if you remember Jesus' words in the New Testament, the two greatest commandments are to love your neighbors, love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We are doing the second one fairly well overall. We tend to love our neighbors consistently a lot better than we do the first.
Unless they disagree with us, then hey.
Then that's the issue. But we tend to fail miserably at the first. And the churches failing at the first considerably by not teaching people how to discern.
That leads me to a different kind of a question then. Are we genuinely loving our neighbors as ourselves if we're not willing to talk to them about difficult things and teach them in these areas?
Yeah,
that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very great question.
I mean, we're doing the best we can as even non-Christians or unregenerate, people can do. You're but then again, your motives are always mixed. If you're shutting up, if you're not saying something because you're afraid you're going to rock the boat, you're going to cause conflict or something like that, a lot of times you're doing it for your own comfort and convenience.
Yeah, it's kind of like we view a lack of conflict as walking in a loving spirit.
Right.
But sometimes conflict is really necessary for true growth. I mean,
yep.
If you think about physical exercise, a benefit of physical exercise is that you're tearing down the body in the process. Why? Because then it rebuilds itself in a stronger fashion. That is, an element of weightlifting, for example. As you start walking, you walk farther and farther each day, you get winded initially, but in the process, you're expanding your ability to breathe. So conflict is part of the growth process. Now, it should be healthy conflict, obviously. You shouldn't be arguing just for the sake of arguing. I've been accused, and apologists are often accused of fighting at the drop of a hat, and we'll drop the hat.
Yeah.
That's probably unhealthy, but this idea that conflict is inherently bad that's a bad idea. Conflict is sometimes necessary to good growth, spiritual growth, intellectual growth.
And the people who really object to conflict don't mind being in conflict with us over it, I've noticed.
Yeah, I have noticed that. Yeah, that's true.
Well, and Peter tells us how we're supposed to be in conflict too. In chapter 1 Peter chapter 3, he gives us guidelines on how we're supposed to go about it, and the manners on how we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to do it in gentleness and kindness and respect. So if we go in and be harsh and rude and crude about it, then we're not doing it in love and kindness and truly loving our neighbor. So,
well, there are some, and Ron was alluding to this, that kind of have created a whole, almost an industrial complex around this idea of.
Well, that's a good segue, Don.
How do you like that? Huh?
Let's go with it. Okay.
Rush Limbaugh here. How do you like that?
Recently, in an emergency meeting at the Toxico Corporation, the project lead, Stu, said, "These protests are delaying the project and killing our bottom line." Foreman Larry said, "All this over a few million dead fish?" PR spokesperson Pam said, "Yeah, we're the real victims here." Across town, a hedge fund manager consults with his lawyer. I feel so left out of the culture wars. I can't afford to be left behind. But where do I find the right victim status to bring me the professional success I'm looking for? Meanwhile, Phil is meeting with his career counselor. I've come to the point where I realize I don't have enough intersectionality on my resume. Do you think I should consider gender reassignment surgery to boost my job prospects? Now there's a solution for all these problems. The grievance industrial complex. The premier manufacturer and recycler of fine grievance products provides grievances customized for your political, economic, and social goals, works closely with you throughout the design and implementation process to ensure your satisfaction. It includes our patented moral high ground, which comes with your own victim status, identity politics tactics, flawless far left ideology, and so much more. And for a limited time, free comes the Total Moron's Guide to Playing the Victim Card for Terrorists. Mustafa Birnow calls this the #1 guide to making fools of the Western mainstream media. And Dr. S.J.W. Jones, professor of Applied Abstractions, Department of Femoral Studies, says, it's even better than the Harry Potter series. Yes, the grievance industrial complex, because things are never bad enough already.
And it does feel like that's where we're at right now. It's not really about the search for truth and how do we live our lives morally and ethically in a society that values, free speech. At least we used to value free speech. We don't really have that anymore. You're not entitled to have views that differ from what we have allowed.
If we allow free speech, then people might say some things that offend us, and that would be offensive. I'm offended just by the thought of being offended.
I am definitely offended by the thought. I find
it very offensive. and really, all that really matters is the fact that I'm offended. So get rid of this free speech. Yeah. Well, that's, the argument we hear.
Mm-hmm.
How dare you offend me? How dare you? It's all about me.
So corrupting our minds, are they intentionally? Oh, here, this is a question of motivation, which we can't always get at. Are professors intentionally trying to corrupt young minds into a different worldview, or is society in some ways now infecting the university so it is sort of is out of their hands as to where things are going to go? How many professors are being subjected to this problem themselves?
What the problem being again?
This whole grievance. This is huge. This whole grievance mentality, the victimhood of society, and everything is the result of some evil white female or evil white male somewhere.
Oh, careful, Don.
That was a big slip.
Yeah. Going to be banned from YouTube.
It's hard to say. It's really
a female could never be white. I mean, I could never be the source of the problem. But
let's be clear now. Well, what we're talking about. Okay, we're talking about something that is deemed offensive.
Yes.
But it's not only that. It's deemed offensive enough to be considered a provocation.
Yes.
And then it's not only that, but it's a sufficient provocation to justify a violent response. Okay. Now, we had a court case in Skokie back in the 1970s.
I remember that. Yeah.
Right, the Nazi trial. Now, this was, at the time, it was difficult for some members of our society to understand why the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which has a very high percentage of Jewish lawyers, and in fact, the lawyers who defended the Nazi Party that wanted to march in Skokie were Jewish, and they made a movie about this, and they depicted very, very wealthy Jewish donors withdrawing funding from the ACLU because they were offended. They were not only offended by just the idea of the Nazis and the Nazis marching in a predominantly Jewish town named Skokie, but the idea that a Jewish lawyer working for the ACLU would also defend. I mean, all this was very, very offensive, very offensive. And it provoked the Jewish donors to withdraw their funding. I didn't see a single Jewish donor punch the Jewish lawyer in the mouth or cause a riot, because as a society, we weren't there. That's not where we were. Now, universities and college campuses think that the ACLU was just out of its mind. And in fact, it's hard to believe we're now in a situation where even today, the ACLU still defends that action that they took, that legal action. They still defend it. They are more conservative.
Yeah.
Can you believe this? We are now living in a day when the ACLU is more conservative than many, if not most, liberal arts college campuses. Think about that. Let that sink in.
Well, even JFK, who was a Democrat president, is more conservative than most Republicans
today.
Yeah.
Today.
Very, very, very true.
Right. And I would suggest a lot of that, it's my opinion, is because of the university system, which has been radically left for a very long, for 40 years at least, radically. In fact, that is what God and Men at Yale. Why am I?
William F. Buckley.
William F. Buckley Jr. God and Men at Yale.
Jr.
His whole contention of that book, which 1951, was kind of a shot across the bow of the university system in that day, saying, look, you guys are teaching Marxism and socialism. You're being supported by capitalists. Now, you have every right to teach whatever you want to teach, but you should be honest enough to tell your supporters that you're teaching against their economic views. So this is not a new problem, and this has been an ongoing situation, and I would argue an ongoing situation for the purpose by those who are perpetrating it to bring us to a different kind of a political system.
Yeah.
Would either of you disagree with that?
The political economic system. Well, it's, we're being told today that there was a very prominent New York Times article that came out, and I'm gonna want to find it because I responded directly to the author, and he acknowledged my response, in which he basically said that cultural Marxism doesn't exist.
Really?
Oh, that's a very common. Oh, you would not be surprised how many people take that line. I'm trying to. I'm trying to find. Oh boy, I responded. I responded to the guy who he tweeted something, and I responded. I gave him a bibliography of books about cultural Marxism that date back to the 1980s.
Okay.
And the list is not super extensive, but it's pretty substantive. I'm going to try to call it up. But anyways, this is a common. I even there was a recent together. What was that? TGC. The Gospel Coalition. A recent Gospel Coalition author basically said that when you talk about cultural Marxism, you're just propagating far right or alt right propaganda just by talking about it.
The Gospel Coalition.
Yeah, the Gospel Coalition is no longer a reliable source of cultural cultural commentary for evangelicals. I do not recommend it anymore. And I would strongly advise of, if you're going to read, anything. Well, anyways, the books that I cited, there was a book by a guy named Wiener in 1981 called Cultural Marxism and Political Sociology. There was a collection of essays by Nelson and Grossberg titled Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture that came out in 1988. Dennis Dworkin wrote Cultural Marxism in Post-War Britain in 1997. And just a little over 12 years ago, Frederick Jameson, who is a cultural Marxist, came out with a collection of essays. Actually, it's a collection of interviews titled "Conversations on Cultural Marxism." You know, it seems kind of odd to me that if it doesn't exist, we have so many books about it.
Right.
Maybe we need to tell the cultural Marxists that it doesn't exist so that they would be informed. And I can't come across the name of the New York Times author, but it was, I think, November. Oh, here it is. No, that's not it. In any case, it was, well, you know, people are saying, well, you shouldn't confuse, you shouldn't really talk about cultural Marxism. You should talk about critical theory. And to a certain extent, yeah, critical theory is a problem, but you know, we're still talking about critical theory is basically Freud and Marx. That's what it is. Okay, Marx, Freud, Hegel, those are the patron saints of critical theory. One person who is extremely well educated in this is Rosario Butterfield. This was her specialty. She was a far left, radical, lesbian, professor of queer theory at Syracuse University, English and queer theory. How do those two get together? Well, anyways, you know, she came out right in one lecture and says, yeah, you know, critical theory basically is Marxism. And so, what is cultural Marxism? It is basically the notion that whereas traditional Marxism said we will solve all the world's problems, literally, we will solve all the world's problems, including the cultural ones, by eliminating the class system, by eliminating economic classes or any kind of social classes. The history of the world is the history of class struggle, said Marx and Engels. So get rid of the classes, you get rid of the struggle. Okay, you get rid of all struggles. You create equalities across the board that never existed before just by doing that one thing, addressing the economic problem of inequality, unequal economics. Cultural Marxism comes along and says, well, you know, how's that working? How's that working out for us?
Yeah.
By the time you get to the 1920s, 30s, the only places where it's happening are places where Marxism should not have taken root yet. In agrarian societies, it was supposed to take root in industrial societies. Why isn't it happening where we said it? We kept Marx and Lenin and those guys said that as the Industrial Revolution progresses, it'll keep on making the rich richer and the poor poorer, which will keep making people unhappy, which will lead to revolution. Hasn't happened, has it? Right. People don't feel so oppressed when they can come home and turn on their color TV set and go to their microwave ovens. You know, even though they have less than the billionaire, they're doing pretty well. So what are we going to do to make them see just how terrible capitalism is? Well, we've got to tell them what's wrong with their culture. We got to tell them all the different ways they're being oppressed, not just the economic ones. That's cultural Marxism in a nutshell. And that's what people are saying doesn't exist, and yet everywhere you turn, you find these far left people who are definitely Marxist telling you why you should be dissatisfied, even though you're doing pretty well financially.
Right. And so it's largely coming, again, from the institutions of higher learning and infiltrating the rest of society. So now there are some good institutions. I like Hillsdale College. I'm sure that there's other ones out there that we might recommend. You might know of some, Jason, that you would recommend to people if they... is there any off the top of your head you might recommend?
Hillsdale there is good. Tacoma Falls is another.
Tacoma Falls or Tacoma?
Tacoma Falls. Are the two that come off the top of my head as far as colleges.
Tacoma Falls. That would be Donald
Williams.
Williams, yeah, right.
Of the two that come off the top of my head as far as Christian universities.
But really, I would suggest that parents in addition to other things that they're doing, maybe you need to take a slight step back and say, okay, maybe talk with your pastor and your elders to say, can we do some lay-friendly classes on reason, logic, as well as to the Christian faith? Help us to prepare our kids so that we can decide how to guide their education as they get older, because this is filtering down into high schools and junior high schools. Even this whole gender identity thing is being filtered down into kindergarten.
It is.
So we need to be able to be training, equipping, and kind of stealing young minds. In other words, making them able to defend themselves from these.
That's steal spelled S-T-E-E-L, not S-T-E-A-L, right? We're stealing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, all right, Jason, it's been good that you were with us today.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We haven't resolved what we've kind of put out there and said it's challenging, and Christian parents and churches, particularly churches, because Christian parents, they have a lot to do already. There's no, just like any other parents, we have to work our jobs, make sure our kids are fed and clothed and cared for and safe. But part of that safe has to do with the mind. It needs to be prepared for the onslaught it's going to experience out in culture. So, Ron, can you walk us out of here?
I can give it a shot. What do you say? Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services are provided by Chef Hammond Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygamous. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping, and our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, but you'll never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never, not a chance.
Not even once.
All right. All right, guys, hold on a second. I'm going to say to everyone else, adios.
Sayonara.
Adios.